So we have one question for Bob, and I think we can take that. And while we're doing that, I'd like to invite all the other people from session 3 up to the stage, and we also have Misha Angrist, who has graciously agreed to pinch hit since Michelle McGowan was not able to make it. I also welcome him, and Devin McGraw as well from one of our keynote speakers. So, and also just a preface, since we've received a comment from online, if you could please introduce yourself and speak clearly into the mic. I will try to take that into advisement as well, so that people online can hear you. They're very interested to know what the questions are. So.
Hi, and this is Manuel Copas. I am Chief Scientist for Cambridge Precision Medicine. My question to Bob was, so you are talking about an aggregation tool that brings data from a very heterogeneous set of resources. So how do you manage to harmonize the different data fields in order to present some kind of coherent, consistent interface in the way you present those data?
It's complicated, right? So we've got two really different problems here. One problem is we've got these data structures that are in these databases, and the database formats are not completely compatible. So we've talked to all the labs that are contributing data to Clinvar and all that stuff. And look, when we talk to labs where they're generating the data that are being used for clinical inference, two universally used resources, Clinvar and Nomad. Everybody's using them. They're completely open. They're incredibly, incredibly important global resources. They are global public goods. Everybody's using those, but everybody's also complaining about, well, you know what, we have to dumb down our data from our database at our lab to send it off to Clinvar, and then they put it in an Excel spreadsheet, and then it may show up 5 months later in Clinvar. So there's lots of complaining about the data formats, the technical issues. You know what, we can solve those problems. It's going to take a while, but ultimately, the information we need is what variant do you have and what happened to you. Right? We can get rid of all the private stuff in between. It doesn't need to be in these public databases. That can stay where it is, in the very private spaces in individual labs and individual hospitals in some cases. So, but we need to build the infrastructure. That means standards, that means sharing practices, and it means incentives for people to do it. It's mainly the incentives for actually sharing the data that has become the biggest barrier. That's another thing instantly about the BRCA situation. Suddenly, think about it. Myriad has a database based on 2 million tests that they've got in a proprietary database, but you have Ambry, GeneDx, Color, Veritas, LabCorp, Quest, they're all entering the market. Guess what? They have to catch up, and they have to be able to interpret those data. So they have a strong incentive to share that we wouldn't always have for other genes. So the Commons has some of the business dynamics that would say, hey, yeah, we can solve this problem, we'll solve it collectively. At the same time, you have an outlier who has a continuing financial incentive not to share its data. And I don't think we're going to solve that problem, except by doing the same thing we did with the human reference sequence. A few years after the human reference sequence was posted, Celera dumped its data into the public database. Why? Because it costs money to maintain a database. And if people are not using it and it costs money for you, why would you keep maintaining it in your own data set when you could just dump it on the public domain and make NLM pay for maintaining it? So I think the same thing will happen to these variants as we discover them in gene after gene, and it will probably start with BRCA1 and 2. So that's problem one. Problem two is the rich data that are in these online networks are free text and, gosh, which mutation do you have? How did you make your decision? Oh my gosh, that's a mess. But again, it's a mess that we're beginning to deal with. And the thing that we need there is the sociology. Jill Holdren, who's part of this network that Amy has talked about and that KJ talked about in his talk, we went out to the people that are on these networks and said, where do you get your information? 70% of their medical information is coming from the online networks. The moderators of those groups are like, hey guys, we really want good information. Please give us, a pathway to the best clinicians and the best scientists who know how to interpret those data. Let's build some bridges among these constituencies. That's a sociological process, and it's a money process, and that's a bunch of volunteers who don't get paid a dime to do that work. So that's a sociologic problem that we have to fix, and we need the pathway for the information to flow from the databases to the users and from the users into the databases. Unsolved problem. But we will solve it.
So there were a couple of related questions that came in online, most for you, Bob. The first one was, can a patient themselves submit their own data to Clinvar? And the second question is, how many women have shared their Myriad data via the Free Your Data initiative? Yeah, so a little wrinkle in the story.
There are a couple pathways for getting data into Clinvar. They are working hard to make it an easy interface. It isn't quite yet, frankly, but you can get it in. The easiest way is actually to do it through a lab that actually contributes its data to Clinvar automatically. So that's Ambry, GeneDx, Invitae, Color. Most of the labs. All of the labs that we talked to, Myriad did not respond to our survey, but all the other labs in the U.S. that we talked to are sharing. A lot of the international labs are not. And that's not because they don't want to. It's because it's a pain in the butt for them to do it, and they don't have the money and the staffing to do it. But in the United States, if you get tested at another place, and there are all these other portals that are being built up around it. And Amy, if you want to pipe in, this is your wheelhouse. So tell us if there are any other pathways for people to get data directly in.
Thank you. Yeah. My name's Amy Coffin. I work for the Rocket Exchange. I think Clinvar is currently the best pathway, and in many ways, in my opinion, what's really needed is some sort of protocol to educate the clinical community on the difference between these testing companies. That's kind of outside the scope of my work at BRCA Exchange, but there's really not a clear delineation of the data sharing practices. There's not a lot of transparency around the data sharing practices. So some sort of call to transparency would be a first step. Clinvar is the main repository that we use, and it depends on where. So it just all depends on where you're located in the world and what kind of data you have, because there's also scientific information that's emerging in literature that can also help.
So, and the second question was about how much data flowed in through the Free the Data movement, and there was a program that was called the Sharing Clinical Data Project. That Bob Nussbaum started when he was at UC San Francisco and has continued. That's kind of a trickle, frankly. The idea was you get your report back from your lab, usually Myriad, because up until 2013 it was the only lab that was doing it, and your provider or you could send it to a bunch of people that would take the form and get what was your variant and what was your diagnosis and get that into the system. And that system operated for a while, but it was a pretty small trickle, and it's a very mechanical, labor-intensive process. And so I think the win came out of the sales to some extent on that project, and I don't think that's the pathway we can rely on in the future.
Yeah, I was wondering if there was the ability to go on and share queries or distribute queries across these things. So let the people keep their data, but simply go on and have a query processing agreement and then come up with a distributed query infrastructure. Has that been looked at?
So one of the cool things about BRCA Exchange is they're trying to set it up in such a way that there's actually a phone app where you can, and incidentally it's a safe phone app, because the data, they don't keep track of your IP address or anything. They dump the data onto your phone so you can do your own interpretation. And if there's been a change in your variant that you're interested in, you can then link back to say, hey, we just found something about that's changed. That's a limited version of that, but in fact, to get that kind of interpretation and stuff like that, you're going to have to take the data about that variant and take it to another place where they can do the interpretation. Oh, yeah, you can, but you're not going to do that through this interface, which is really basically, what do you know about my variant?
So what about concentrating on an interface that allows that?
That's exactly what we're doing.
And can I ask for the panelists, if you're answering a question, and if the person is not at the microphone, if you could repeat the question for the people online? Thanks. And we had one more online.
Yeah, there was a follow-up question about couldn't Myriad develop a secure access? So it's a somewhat related question. So the question is, have people tried to engage Myriad around a model to provide access to the data online? So sort of a Yale open data access model.
Yeah, so Devin answered that question to some extent. Look, yeah, you can get your own data. Absolutely. And you can actually say to any lab, not just Myriad, you can say to any lab, give me my data and give it to them. So that pathway does exist. That started in October of 2014. And so that's an open pathway now. It's laborious, and one individual at a time is probably not the right way to solve that problem, but individuals who do want to solve that problem that way can do it.
Stacey Gray, City of Hope. This is a question for all of the panelists, but maybe to start with Greg. So you spoke a little bit about the differences between opt-in and opt-out consents, and thinking about how to structure consent in a way where people are truly informed about what they're doing with many of these issues, which are quite complex. So one of the questions just to everyone is, particularly in the context of people who are sick and patients who are dealing with a lot, how can we think about really revising and transforming informed consent so that people understand what they're consenting to, at the same time not being so burdensome that we restrict research?
In the little bit of research that we're doing on privacy, where I'm actually having an undergraduate student call various hospitals across the country and ask them, what is your informed consent policy, and how would I withdraw my medical information from all studies at your institution? And what we're finding out is there's really just two tiers so far, and this is preliminary. There are institutions that are taking making remarkable efforts and investments to talk individually to patients and take this very seriously, and will even talk to my undergraduate to explain very carefully what they do. And then there are systems that are cheating and are just taking information. There is no consent at all. It is what seems to be an implied consent if you belong to, say, these university hospitals that have either opt-out programs or are performing this type of research that they don't call research. So I think what's needed is some basic consumer protection laws first, that just say you cannot you cannot take people's tissues or data representation of their tissues for research without having them opt in, period. And then, I'll leave it to the people who are real experts, because I don't deal with patients, and I'm sure there's a lot of really great research on how to do that, and other people can speak. But we've got to have a baseline, because the institutions that are reaping, and there's another word that sounds like that the most information from their patients, have nothing in place in terms of informed consent, and everyone's jealous of them. I'm at a state university; they would never allow me to do that. It's mostly private institutions. I was amazed that the university system in California is able to do this. There's a lot of money being poured into these labs, and they're getting data without informed consent.
I'd like to add something to this. This conversation around how to get informed consent and whether consent should be required for all research is not a new one. It's existed for a very, very, very long time. It's one that, we recently struggled with yet again in revisions to the Common Rule for federally supported programs and research. And, you know, it's an issue that certainly gets dealt with in HIPAA as well. The standard is that you get informed consent before you use someone's data for research purposes. And it's hard to do well, as you pointed out, because you oftentimes get one shot to sort of ask to try to get that consent in a very informed way. And John Wilbanks, who was here earlier, and the materials that he has developed in his toolkit at SAGE, they do it probably the best of anybody that I have ever seen in terms of trying to get it to be informed and really sort of probing people to, you know, how informed is it? Do you sort of truly understand what's going on here? But there's another issue, which is that it is, we have these possibilities for consent to be waived in circumstances where it would essentially not be possible to do the research because the number of people involved and having to go back and reconsent them into a new research project would make it very difficult to do so, and frankly would keep the research from happening. And so you have an institutional review board or a privacy board in the case of HIPAA, but most people use institutional review boards, which are supposed to have expertise around ethics to consider whether the value of the research and the protections that have been put into protecting the privacy of the data, which usually involves removing some measure of identifiers out of the data, contractual commitments around re-identification and things of that nature, justify doing the research without consent, without needing to go back and get the consent of the patient. So it is a weighing of the importance of the research questions being asked against what are the risks from an ethical as well as a privacy standpoint around the consent pieces. And it doesn't work perfectly, and it certainly falls down, but I would be greatly concerned about an absolute prohibition on doing any research with any data under any circumstances without consent, because I believe that it tips the scale in the wrong direction around the ability to use data for research purposes. I'm not suggesting that there's not value to consent, and I'm not suggesting that people ought not to have more control over their data. That's what we're all about at Citizen. But at the same time, I don't think that where you draw that line is, it's consent or nothing. It also places a little bit too much pressure, puts a little bit too much of the burden for protecting people and using their data appropriately on the individual. It's frankly really easy to get people's consent for things, even when you do it really well and inform them. A lot of times, and particularly with sick people, they say yes because they want to save themselves and they want to save other people. We need other ways to ethically review whether some particular use of data ought to move forward than just relying on whether someone says yes or not.
Yeah, can you hear me? I'd like to echo that last point, Devin, that you made with respect to sick people saying yes. And sick people say yes to things that I don't think that they fully understand. And I know, speaking for myself, I'm one of those people where I have been asked right before surgery if I would sign a consent form. And of course I'm just like, am I going to live? Am I going to die? Oh, you want me to sign something? Okay, go, and I'll go ahead and sign it. And what I might be signing is I have no right to request any of that tissue. It doesn't fall under HIPAA protections. The institution that I may have signed this contract with is able to prevent me from acquiring that tissue, even if they're not using it for anything. But I'm not allowed to acquire it and put it toward research at any other institution unless it benefits them directly. And these are things that we are often asked to say yes to at the most dire moments of our lives. Mm-hmm. I think we have to consider when it is we're asking for consent and for what, in addition to how we're asking for consent. And that's not a conversation I've really ever heard brought up in a serious way in these circles at this time. It's like how you get consent, but not when you get consent. So I definitely want to flag that. And then a question, Devin, for you is I would love to hear if any of the institutions that scored pretty low on your scorecard were made aware of those scores, and if they responded, or if there's any kind of like circle of feedback where they could be like, look, we fixed it all.
So we emailed all 51 institutions 2 days in advance of the scorecard coming out and let them all know what their score was. And I got calls from 3. Now, having said that, we had one of them was at the bottom. 2 of them were not so bad, actually. They were in the middle. But they were concerned that they were in the middle. The one at the bottom was very concerned that they were at the bottom. I wish that I had gotten 26 phone calls, but I didn't. But I want to say a couple of things about that. 1, they were very good conversations with those 3 institutions. 2, we did this, and it's the first time anybody has ever done this with a scorecard that names names and evaluates people. We're going to do this again for another, I think, 250 institutions. And we're also going to rescore anybody that we had more recent requests for. So there's room for improvement. There's room also to come down if you're not consistent in how you do this. But this is not a one-shot deal. We'll do it again and again. And I suspect that over time, if we're able to sort of keep up a 2-month tick with this, we'll start getting some more phone calls.
It's fabulous.
Thank you.
Can I just follow up on that? So why not publish the names of the institutions with their scores like a Consumer Reports type
I did.
thing? Oh,
it's on the website.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
That.
It's okay.
Great.
Yeah, no, it is on the website. It is the first time I think that anybody has done that. Quality measurement 101, right? Yep. What gets measured and publicly reported gets improved over time. So that's what we hope will happen.
Now you just have to get funding for little plaques that they could put up their reception. We're a gold group or whatever.
Yeah, right, we go, woohoo! That's a really good idea.
So a question regarding the informed consent. It is clearly flawed, but there are actually alternatives, right? Like dynamic consent and actually ownership-based data governance. I just want to hear your thoughts on those actually different consent models.
So, having a lot of friends on the IRB in 2014, 15, 16, 17, the overriding palpable emotion I got from them over the NPRM and the Common Rule revision process was abject fear. Because change is hard, and, they were concerned about centralized IRBs. And I think with respect to consent, I'm not saying anything that people in this room probably don't know, but it's not really for the participant. It is to mitigate liability for the institution. And that's why every consent form, at my institution at least, is way too long, way too jargony. And, since I was the geneticist when I was in the IRB, it was always, Misha, do we need GINA language in there? And it was simply kind of a box-checking exercise. And I say that with nothing but respect and affection for those people, because they're trying to do this thing that has all of these rules. And again, I think it comes back to incentives. So I think Devin is absolutely right that Sage Bionetworks has done heroic work in changing how we do informed consent and making it a much more authentic process. But how do you convince an academic medical center to basically, start over?
Well, I believe maybe the new common rule is that starting to nudge a little bit, though. Wasn't it adopted that now consent forms have to have a summary on the first page in plain language? Are you skeptical?
2 cheers.
Can I just make...
that you reminded me of something, and that is consent forms, at least for clinical trials, are supposed to be made public, but I don't know when that's going to take effect. But I think, once we can hold these 35-page documents up to the light, that maybe, like what Devin did with HIPAA, it will be possible to shame people.
Can I just make a real quick plea? We have a pretty diverse audience. Can someone describe or tell us what the common rule is and why it's important?
And before you do that, I also wanted to make a comment that a lot of the things that we've been talking about today don't necessarily fall under the common rule or HIPAA, and there might be other things that are relevant that if anybody on the stage could bring up, I think everybody here would appreciate that.
Well, I was just reviewing before I got up. I just got a Department of Justice grant to use genealogical forensic genealogy to help people get out of prison who are innocent by finding the real perpetrators when we have a little DNA from a crime scene. And they just put out a temporary statement about forensic genealogy that is, 7 pages long, and I can't figure out if the money that they just gave me, if I can use it for what I said I'm going to do. So, every group seems to have new rules coming out because of what's going on. But what we haven't seen, and what I haven't heard much of today, is actionable, legal ramifications. Like what needs to happen is the lawyers need to fire up. There have to be lawsuits. People have to be able to show they've been damaged by these things, and then we'll have some meaningful discussions. But as it is now, every shop seems to make up their own. I write my own consent forms. I'm at Boise State University. How many forms does my IRB see? How aware are they? They're professors like me on that committee. But what I've found is basically like with the Vanderbilt story, and I haven't followed up with them in several years, when I asked how many would you have gotten, they got 100,000 biobanking samples at the time I talked to them. How many would you have gotten if it was opt-in? And she said 50,000. She had a number, which means they did some research. And so what it seems to me is if I'm bringing grandma to the hospital because she broke her finger, and I'm saying, Grandma, do you want to give your DNA? It's just like when the retirement person comes around to me and says, you got to put your money in somewhere in this 401, and all they're trying to determine is how risk averse am I? If I'm someone who throws caution to the wind and is all for, giving humanity my DNA, that might be a green, right, on a form, and there might be a yellow and there might be a red, because really what we need to determine from patients is what is their risk aversion. In a very simple calculation, we don't have to explain to them what they're doing, but if somebody's like, I don't care what you do with my DNA, they could check off the form that says give my DNA. But that's really what, to me, the clinicians need to determine in my just experience with sick people is, you need to assess this person. Is this a person who wants to give their stuff and doesn't care about risks? Are they really risk averse? In which case you need to care for them. Or are they in the middle ground and you got to spend more time talking to them? But by treating everyone as a semi-expert, it frightens me when you say there has to be a front page summary of a consent form. That means it's a multiple page form. No one reads anything beyond one page. Right? We've all signed mortgage documents. There's 50 pages there. I'll look at the first page. So I really think this kind of measurement of risk aversion is probably what we should go to when we can obtain personal consent.
That's an interesting thought. To get back to the sort of baseline question around level setting, so the common rule is a set of requirements on human subjects research, which applies when you are doing research on humans and when you are doing research on identifiable data about human beings. It needs to be followed when you are doing federally funded research, or if you are doing research that itself might not be federally funded, but you are in an institution that receives federal funding and you have agreed to do all your research in compliance with the common rule. Right? Yeah. Christy can correct me if I missed it.
No, I would just add that so what the common rule requires is just the basics, is it does require that these research activities be reviewed by an institutional review board before they begin, who will evaluate the protocol, the risks and benefits of the protocol, and make sure that the risks are reasonable in relation to any benefits that might be received. And they also are charged with ensuring that informed consent is received, and so or obtained, I should say. And there are detailed provisions about what needs to be in the informed consent form. So we've had the common rule. It's called the common rule because over a dozen federal agencies have signed on to it, so we call it the common rule. But it's been in place for over 20 years. But about 6 years ago, it got another look because it was recognized that research and technologies have changed a lot, and the original common rule was probably not as protective or was missing some things, and so it went through I think it was 4-year-long process to revise it. There was a notice of proposed rulemaking, an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, a notice of proposed rulemaking, and then it finally was finalized. And it went into effect in early 2018.
Oh, God, it went back and forth for so long. I don't remember when. Yeah. January 2018.
But it generally is our touchstone for research ethics. And I will add, although the common rule covers generally federally funded research, some private researchers are still covered by some federal research subject protections to the extent that their activities are regulated by the FDA. So the FDA has adopted its own research subject protections, which are not identical, but are close to it.
Right, and then there's HIPAA, which also has rules around research uses of data for entities covered by HIPAA. So it's a very short legal primer. But it is correct that it doesn't apply to everyone collecting data in the space.
Yeah, it really becomes, I just want to say, it becomes an alphabet soup, and something that I'm really worried about is sort of different definitions and standards. So the common rule talks about data being not identifiable, and the HIPAA talks about it being de-identified. And then the 21st Century Cures Act was enacted, and it's concerned about sensitive private information. And those definitions are not talking to each other, and I think that further confuses this landscape.
So if you have the impression that the common rule is like the Old Testament and we are Talmudic scholars or presumptive Talmudic scholars, you're absolutely right, because there are all of these kind of metaphysical weird things. For example, Greg knowingly or otherwise alluded to this earlier. If you're doing quality improvement, then your work is not subject to the common rule. And so there's an incentive, if you don't want to go through the IRB gauntlet, to frame what you're doing as quality improvement. On the other hand, we've seen counterexamples, most famously or infamously, Peter Pronovost's checklist at Johns Hopkins that Atul Gawande wrote about, where they were trying to just put up a checklist, wash your hands before you do surgery. And they were studying that. And the fact that they were studying that in the eyes of the Office of Human Research Protections made it research and required full IRB review.
So there was another question online that I think would be relevant. So they asked or commented that there has been a lot of discussion about challenges and ethical considerations of sharing data, issues with interpretation, privacy, and clear communication of the limitations of the privacy. Do panelists have any suggestions on paths forward or next steps?
You got to take that one, Christy. You don't want to comment on the IOM report?
I didn't hear that part.
Yeah, so just the...
Repeat it?
Yeah, would you mind?
Sure. So there's been a lot of discussion about challenges and ethical considerations regarding the sharing of data, issues with interpretation, privacy, and clear communication of the limitations of the privacy. Do panelists have any suggestions on paths forward or next steps?
No, it's not IOM.
Yeah, okay.
So I do think that there's a lot of models out there, and there are more popping up every day, and I actually don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because I don't know that there is any one way to do data sharing for research. Just it's this way or no way at all, right? We've had lots of examples here of more patient-controlled models, like the one that we're trying to build at Citizen, where people get their data and push it out to the researchers in the ways that they want to. We've had other examples of, sort of Clinvar and other databases where there's an attempt to really create a public resource. Corey and her question, and some other folks that I was talking to at the break were talking about how, all right, we're talking about data, but what do we do about tissue? Right? Like patients might have the ability to go get their data, but they don't have the ability necessarily to go get their tissue and make sure that it is used for research purposes. So I think there's lots of sort of potential out there. There are research consortia that exist around pediatrics in particular. They tend to do a really good job actually at coming together to share data for research purposes. So I think there's lots of promising models out there. Maybe we don't do enough to study the different aspects of those models and why they work, to build trust, to facilitate sharing, to do so in a way that produces results that then can be replicated. Maybe we report the outcomes of that research, or we hope that we do, and we don't do enough to study maybe why some of those research networks and approaches work or don't work, so that we can learn the mechanics of how we do this as well as getting the results.
Maybe we ought to be able to trademark our genomes and trademark our person while we're alive. And I don't know what happens once people are dead with the common rule. Is it what are samples from deceased people covered? No. So the moment you die, that's it. But
HIPAA survives.
You're not human. HIPAA survives, though.
For 50 years, but there are special provisions around research with deceased persons' information. It's a little less stringent. If you can justify that you need the deceased person's data for this particular project.
So that might open up a whole field.
One small suggestion, and that is we need more genetic counselors for the interpretation piece. They are so important. They are more important now than ever. And I would love to see them embedded within any systems that are providing information back to patients to make them available.
So I have a couple of maybe somewhat related questions. So Christy, on your slide, you mentioned that you were kind of concerned about the policy and the regulation aspects and sort of some things slipping through cracks. And maybe in my mind, a related question, which is the relationship between personal utility and clinical utility. Yeah. And it seems like the regulation may impact one but not the other.
Yeah. Well, actually, the HIPAA access right says that you cannot. I don't know if it's the interpretation or the actual regulation, but in terms of personal utility, you can have access to anything you want, so long as it qualifies as protected health information contained within the designated record set. So if you want your DNA to make wallpaper out of it, that's fine, and your healthcare provider is not allowed to deny you access on those grounds or any grounds, and really is not even supposed to ask why you want it. So personal utility is, is respected, whatever whatever utility you might be able to gain from it. And that includes enjoyment. And I think that is a potential benefit. Individuals can enjoy, for instance, participating in scientific discovery to the extent they're doing that, or just enjoy learning new information about themselves.
So I've been hesitating to ask this question, so I'm Josh Waterfall from the Institute Curie, and I've been hesitating to ask this because it's really for Richard Milne, who isn't with us anymore, but maybe some of you can give some insight. If I saw some of his slides correctly, one of the questions was they distinguished whether people were willing to let their data be analyzed by academic researchers within their own country versus other countries. And when I deposit data, this is not a sort of difference I can make for the DAC has to check the country that the researchers are from. But so is this really a direction that consent and data sharing is moving in? What can you say about that?
A couple things to say about that. One is when we're talking about genomic data, there are actually national laws that are in Russia, India, many parts of the world are passing laws in order to prevent biocolonialism. They're not comfortable just sending their data to an out-of-country repository. So there are national laws, and there's a thicket of them that have to be negotiated. And so that's a reality. The other thing that is interesting is when Mary Majumdar has done a kind of a survey of people's concerns about sharing data across borders, and it turns out that the trust level drops off as soon as you add the going to a foreign country, as much as it drops off even more, actually, than to a company. So there's something going on that hasn't been really probed. I don't know that that's showing up in informed consent documents yet, but it's one of the things that we've observed as a phenomenon that's beginning to emerge. There's lots of friction in international data sharing.
I've seen it show up in the data security context. So I've never seen it in an informed consent document to deal with individuals participating in research or individuals consenting to have their data used for something. But when entities consider whether they will share with another entity, there is a lot of concern about cross-border transfers of data because of the differences in the laws. And then also it comes up also in data storage and the willingness to use offshore providers, particularly in countries where there's some uncertainty regarding whether the rights that the entity feels they have in that data will be respected.
Along those same lines, for those of us with rare cancers, sharing genomic data across borders may be the only way we get a large enough sample size to come to any conclusions.
And the dynamics of sharing rare disease data are so unique and so important, and you're absolutely right. It doesn't mean that it's not an obstacle, unfortunately.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about underrepresented communities, not just in the researchers, but also, some of the issues that came up, I believe, was with the Havapai some years ago in Arizona, with that finding out their ancestry and the forensics about that and populations that came over. So that's sort of at the definitional level of what is ethical and how do you share information. But then also just communities that have well-earned mistrust of the medical establishment, of participation, and also just simply of, at the point of diagnosis, is this really when you should be asking someone to think about these expansive big issues when they've just received a terminal diagnosis of some sort?
Bless your heart for asking that question, because I realize I should have put that in my talk. I really apologize. There are a bunch of issues that do bear on indigenous communities in the United States and Canada and all over the world. And many of the tribes have actually, the Navajo had a moratorium on genetics research. They're beginning to rethink that now. There's a whole group of the National Congress of American Indians that is thinking about this, and their policies are focused on retaining their sovereignty, which is very serious and has real legal meaning, and a history of distrust. My own university is the source of that distrust in part because of the Havasupai case. At least at ASU, we have decided we just have to grab that by its reins and confront it directly and be quite honest that we know that we screwed up and let's not do that again. And we know that we can't be setting the health priorities for an indigenous community. That said, we do have a really serious problem. And think about the example that I gave of BRCA mutations. If you're an Ashkenazi Jew, you have a good data set and a lot of people that have been tested. But one of the numbers that was on my slide was a study that came out in 2016, so 3 years ago, was done in China on sequential people who came in with breast and ovarian cancer. 41% of the variants that were discovered were not in the public data set that they compared that to. We're going to find that over and over again in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and in every indigenous population for certain genes like late onset dementias and things like cancer, late onset cancers. We're going to be finding founder mutations in populations that have not been tested. We're going to find variants that we don't know how to interpret until we actually get those communities engaged in our health system and include them in our systems of gathering information. And that's one of the things that all of us is trying to solve, right? Trying to diversify the base of people that are in the tent. So we've got these problems that are almost antithetical to one another. One is not enough stuff going on and well-justified distrust of the research system. And we have to solve both of those problems simultaneously for indigenous communities, too.
I'll just talk about the forensic side of things. You know, the database, the criminal database we have for DNA is enriched for minority populations for all the socioeconomic reasons you might imagine. However, there's been a bit of a flip, and where this became important is in something we call familial searching. It's not genealogy. It's when we look at the criminal database, and some states will allow you to look for a relative of evidence. So if we have semen, as I spoke about in that earlier case, I was trying to get our state to look for a brother, cousin, uncle of the semen donor in the convicted offender database. Idaho wouldn't allow me to do it. Some other states do that. But that obviously, makes you more likely to find a match in enriched minority populations. So there's significant questions about civil rights that can be brought up there. The flip is that it's generally Caucasians who participated in the genealogical studies that are the publicly available databases like GEDmatch, to the point where before GEDmatch just changed its rules. Now you have to opt in to being criminal searches. But before that, they had enough in there, 1.2 million or something, where there was a 65% chance that any Caucasian in this room who left DNA, we could find your last name through this publicly available database by swabbing your cup or whatever. And so that just shows you how these different demographic groups have concerns that are sometimes kind of unpredictable. Another issue is, if we ever get an equal rights amendment in this country, there's going to be, I think, a huge concern about the fact that we have male-specific markers in forensics. So the Y chromosome DNA is a big part of my field, and that's because 95+% of the rapes are by males, and so we look at male-specific markers. There is no equivalent female-specific markers, and so again you have a database bias where one group is represented much more for good reasons. Anyway, I think all of this starts becoming very complicated as there's more and more data being shared. Who is it that's participating in medical studies who has to worry about the risk of their information being shared versus people who are not reached by the medical system? So there's a lot of social issues that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I just have one point I want to bring up with respect to consent. It relates more to the commercial area, and it was from 10 years ago, but I think it might help inform you figuring out the questions you want. At the time, we were talking about privacy and personal information in shipping things to people from orders placed over the Internet, and the woman succinctly put it quite well. She said, there's great concern inside our population for retaining personal information, not releasing it, making sure that everything is kept private, and they're willing to give that all away for free shipping. So it turns out that, in fact, if you understand the motivations of the people coming in, you might find that getting consent is not as hard as you think.
Well, maybe they said yes to free shipping, but they didn't agree to then have that data subsequently used for about 90 other purposes, right? Yeah.
Well, actually, that's what it's used for.
Right.
Okay, so Christy, you spoke of third-party tools that interface with DTCs for consumers to use, and this morning during session 2, there were a lot of concerns with DTCs, and in particular the fact that individuals are not empowered with the resources to really understand and use the information provided by DTCs. And so the question is, are there third-party tools that can help address this issue? Or if not, how do we incentivize the development of the resources that people actually need to really understand DTCs?
Yeah, I think that many of these tools are a response to the limited information that the DTC genetic testing companies are providing or can provide under FDA regulations. So that's my understanding is you know, since you have access to your raw data, you know, that was the response, is let's build these tools to help understand those data. So, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not understanding the question. I think we are seeing the universe somewhat expand, and I will say, you know, Prometheus was just purchased by MyHeritage, which is a major direct-to-consumer genetic testing firm, and so I'm very interested in what they are going to do and whether this might set some sort of precedent for DTC genetic testing companies offering more sort of ancillary interpretive tools along the lines of these bridge to the literature services, and that's what they call themselves, that, you know, they're not providing diagnostic information. They're just taking that information from another source and organizing it and presenting it to users. So Prometheus pulls its information from SNPpedia, which is a crowdsourced wiki, but other third-party tools are pulling from other data sources.
So there was another question which actually has gotten some several likes online, and the question is, what would be the funding mechanism or motivation for researchers for the extra work in summarizing research data and sharing results and sharing research data back to the patient, while all of these work may not lead to a visible publication? So it's getting to the, I guess, back to how to motivate people and how do we incentivize researchers to do this?
So the analogy I use is open access publishing. When Harold Varmus and Richard Roberts and Michael Eisen et al. Hatched this, 18 years ago, there was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of resistance from commercial science publishers. There was a lot of resistance from societies. This is our revenue source. And to his enormous credit, Harold Varmus said, yeah, we're going to do this. So I think it could, somebody using the bully pulpit could help. but I think it has to become sort of a cultural norm. It has to be this kind of thing that it's looked upon as a good deed, maybe something you can put on your CV, the same way NSF rewards public outreach, public engagement. That takes a long time.
And I'll just add to that real quick. Andy Fawcett from Geisinger. One of the things we did early in ClinGen is we created a wall of fame and a wall of shame, like Devin did, in the sense, I think, publicizing the labs that are contributing their data on a regular basis and the labs that are not contributing their data. And then also going to the institutions that are ordering testing and saying, are you using labs that aren't sharing their data? We actually have a policy at Geisinger that we only use labs that share data. And if you don't share data, salespeople go somewhere else. So I think you have to, but again, it's recognizing those who are doing what we think they should and recognizing those who are not doing what we think they should and be willing to stick it out there.
And if I could just enter one thing, I actually think, I'm going to sound like Pollyanna here, and I apologize for that, but I think most people, even in the hardest core molecular biology labs that are doing biomedical research, actually do want to reach the end patients. That's why they're doing what they're doing. And we just need to make it a little bit easier and have a mild reward set, and I think we don't have that. It's a culture of that's not real science, and I think we need to broaden that definition, and certainly I see as part of my task is broadening the definition of what good science is to include the people that you're doing the science for. We haven't built that into our culture, but I think, that's what's going to happen. Millennials will bring that, right? So I think... and we need to work hard to make it easier. So,
I also think it's the culture of human subjects research at academic medical centers. So, my friend Carl Elliott compares getting IRB approval. It's like a combination of a tax audit and a trip to the DMV, and and so people are like, if I can just do this. It's like what a lot of my students say to me, what do you want, Professor Angris? Just tell me what you want and I'll give it to you. And that's not the way to have a sort of engaged, reflective, this is a good thing to do that I should want to do, rather than what do I have to do to get this in my rearview mirror.
So if I could also make a comment on this, I don't have a question, I just want to add in. I do think that there's something seriously wrong with our reward mechanism because they do have to publish in order to keep their jobs, right? We've really done a bad job of setting up the environment for clinical researchers and preclinical researchers. But also there is a movement afoot to change that. And unfortunately, it's not coming from maybe the people with the most money that would wield the most influence there. But there are small efforts. There are foundations who are starting to write that into their grant guidelines, saying that, if you're not sharing the data, then you don't get this pot of money, right? And so I think we just need to look at that on a broader scale, and certainly NCI could make a huge difference with that if they were to change some of their policies and put a little more carrot there and a little less stick. But there are some efforts out there, and one's going on right now, so I wanted to give a little shout out to researchsymbiont.org. That is actually an award that people can apply for if you're sharing your data. They want to recognize that. So please do. There haven't been a lot of applications right now, and the deadline is approaching. So if you know somebody that's sharing their data, please encourage them to apply for that, because we want to reward that kind of behavior.
Great. I was wondering if anyone had any familiarity with any case law that's actually where patients have shown harm successfully through the court system and won damages, because we've talked a little bit about how long these consent forms are, in part just to protect the institution, and that lawyers all have different interpretations at all these different institutions. But what are they drawing from in terms of real fear? I know there was the recent case that was just filed this summer a gentleman thought that his data had been turned over from some Chicago hospitals inappropriately to Google for some research. But I was wondering if anyone had sort of a more current understanding of what's actually happened in the court system.
It's a good question, but I haven't really studied that in a while. I feel like there's the issue around the oxygenation rates for preemies and some of the issues that happened there with respect to the research that was done there. That wouldn't surprise me if there was some case law on that, but I'm not familiar with it. Yeah.
And I'm not familiar either with any case law around harms from physical harms. However, Bob just reminded me of an Alaska case that I believe is still working its way through the court system. So Alaska is one of a handful of states that has a genetic property law. It's a state law that says that an individual's genetic information is that person's property, and it cannot be disclosed, et cetera, without permission. And there was an individual in Alaska who was tested by Ancestry.com and was receiving all kinds of spam email and got online to see if his email address had been posted somewhere online. And that's when he found that actually his genetic data had been posted online. So he sued gene by gene under that statutory provision. And it was going back and forth, Gene by Gene claimed it was unconstitutionally vague, and that didn't go anywhere. And Bob, what's the latest?
I don't know. I just know about the case. So you asked if there's case law. There probably will be.
My go-to on this kind of stuff is Andy's colleague Jen Wagner at Geisinger, who really tracks that space closely. And I'm sorry if I put her on the spot.
My question is about IRB approvals for consent forms. At my institution, we're seeing more and more deferral to another IRB for a multi-site study. And some of these things come in, and our IRB never would have approved what is getting handed to us. And now we have the single IRB initiative coming in next year. And I'm worried that researchers are going to be going to look, because they don't want to go through the tax audit and procedure, looking for where is it easiest to get approved and who is the lowest denominator. And that's what we're going to be getting in. And I really think some of them are extremely subpar. And I'd like to hear what you think of this.
Well, I was just going to say, so it's really interesting. The history of the IRB system is, you go back to, it was actually created by NIH under threat of legislation from the Senate. And all of us have gotten used to these exemptions. All those exemptions were written in 24 hours just before the regulation was posted to the Federal Register. Charlie McCarthy has been threatening to write a book about this forever. So the principles were really clear. You need to get informed consent, and we need an independent audit of whether the research makes sense enough that people should volunteer to get into it. There was agreement on that general principle coming out of the National Commission. But it took 10 years to get the common rule through the first time. It took actually 10 years to get the common rule revised. And so it's a really, really, really inertial process. But one of the reasons that it's so inertial is all the authority was left at the institutional level. There is no appeals process. There's a federal office that kind of oversees the process, but there is no appeals process. The way the law usually works is you have a district court that has an appeals court that has a Supreme Court, and you get some harmonization over time through the case law. We don't have that capacity for IRBs. So yes, there is going to be inconsistency among IRBs for the foreseeable future because there's no mechanism for harmonization and building case law. It's just a flaw in how the system was set up because it was set up really quickly under pressure. And I don't think you're right. Could there be forum shopping? Yeah, there could. And the other problem is there are IRBs that are ridiculously anal and painful, and that's an equal problem. And we've got both problems in the real world at the same time.
I think we have one last question before we end for the day from the online audience.
Yep. So this question is there a role for policymakers to provide tools and or guidance to research participants to help them interpret their genetic data, or should we focus more on facilitating access to genetic counselors and other experts?
I don't know if I would want the policymakers educating the public on this. But certainly, Christy's call for more genetic counselors feels like an issue where if the policymakers put some funding behind that in order to help those programs flourish and to encourage people to pursue that as a career is one possible good start.
Quickly related to that, there's never been federal funding to support genetic counseling. One of the fields that got in a little bit late, so yes.
Yeah, and just a comment in general, which is I think let 1,000 flowers bloom. We're experimenting right now with a bunch of new technologies that are generating oodles and noodles and noodles of new data that we've never had to deal with. And we don't have the system for helping people interpret that yet. The online support groups can be incredibly powerful for doing that, and they're asking for help. We have to build that bridge. The genetic counselors are really, really important. But there aren't enough of them, and we don't have a system for paying for them. That's a priority for them right now, is get the states to say, hey, yeah, we're actually health professionals, please pay us, other than through a doctor. So there's a bunch of stuff, and I think we just need to let the system kind of adjust, and we need to be paying attention to it. And yes, policymakers damn well better be paying attention to it, because they're the ones who control the money.
So before I forget, I just want to say that I am a very poor person's Michelle McGowan. I wish she were here. But I would loudly echo what has been said about the need for more genetic counselors, and I would go further. I don't know if it's still true, but there used to be more active astronauts in NASA than certified adult geneticists. And so we have unleashed this torrent of data on ourselves and each other, but we no longer have a PhD medical genetics program, and as a clinical geneticist once said to me, I could have stopped after I completed my residency in internal medicine, but I decided to do a fellowship in clinical genetics so I could make less.
A quick comment on that. We need not only geneticists and counselors, but we need molecular tumor boards. For people who have genomically driven counselors, you can't go to a genetic counselor. You have to go to a molecular tumor board, and there are very few of them.
All right, so I think we'll end on that note, and it's a nice transition to tomorrow, which is a more clinically focused session. So please join me in thanking the panelists and all the speakers for today.